Alright guys, welcome to Lecture 8, Part 2. We are going to be moving forward with the 1920s. I want to take a peek, as we always do, with your outline for the week. This week you have 2 assignments, just 2, another light week. You have your Journal 22, which you're going to reflect on this lecture in, as well as the 4 readings for this week. Yes, there's only 4. 47C, 47E from the ushistory.org online text, and then you have the 2 PDFs, the Sacco and Vanzetti and Scopes trial. Thursday, I would suggest working on the Unit 9 document set 1. This document set is all about the changing role of women from the late 1800s through the 1920s. Now, I would suggest on Friday to set some time aside to start planning out, start working on that paper 8. Know that that's not due until March 19th, but also know that March 19th you will have a test, readings, journal, and an assignment. So you know that week is going to be heavy. Make sure you start working on that assignment ahead of time. All right, so we are getting to the fun stuff this week. We are getting to the point where we can start talking about the changing culture of the 1920s. This week in class, I asked everybody, what did you remember about the 1920s? And many people responded with the flappers because we oftentimes note the culture of the 20s, the jazz, the poetry, the clothing, the speakeasies, and that's the fun stuff that we get to talk about here today. So the changing culture, what do we mean by that? Well, first of all, like we talked about when we started to talk about Ford last week, there's a change in the working life of people. We are no longer in the Gilded Age where people were working, 90 hours a week. Now we're moving to a point where maybe we're working 50, 60 hours a week, which is a lot. Don't get me wrong. The average work week now is supposedly 40 hours, but we're coming down in work hours, and the work week has really been shaved out to where we work Monday through Friday and we have that weekend time off, opening up leisure time. The salary for workers has also been increasing. So, because of that change in work life, we have opened a new realm where people can start to take in different leisure activities. The radio is going to be absolutely monumental, not only to the 1920s, but the culture of the nation of the United States that gets created. On the radio, we're going to hear sporting events. We're going to hear about different stories. People will listen to that. People are going to hear music that they can share. The first commercial radio station in the United States is going to come out in the 1920s. We have Pittsburgh's KDKA being the first commercial radio station, and that happens in 1920, and then just 3 years later there's more than 500 radio stations in the nation. So the radio hits and it takes off. By the end of the 1920s, there are going to be more than 12 million radios in households across the United States. That is huge because we are connecting the nation through music, through news, through stories that are being told, radio talk shows that people will tune into. Think of the radio as the first TV, okay? We don't have the picture TV in homes, we have the radio. Today we all sit down and watch a common show that's shown across the United States. During this time, we sat down and we listened to the radio that we could hear a common show across the United States. The single most significant instrument of the 1920s of the mass entertainment industry is the movie. Movie attendance is going to absolutely skyrocket. We are going to see 50 million people attending movies in 1920. That number is going to increase to 90 million people weekly in 1929 going to the movies. They are going to spend on average of about 83 cents of every dollar going to the movies. Three-fourths of the population went to a movie in a theater every week. And this is going to be teenagers, it's going to be adults. In the earliest days, cinema was based in the nation's theatrical center, which is going to be New York. That should be no surprise. New York City is huge. New York, the cornerstone for production, for the city life. So of course that's where this takes off. By the 1920s, though, the industry is going to relocate to Hollywood, and that's because it's drawn by cheap land and cheap labor. What we're going to see is in this time period, Hollywood's going to release about 700 movies that are going to dominate worldwide. We are going to see a shift in the market from Europe to the United States in the movie industry. We'll have a small group of companies that really consolidate control in the film industry, and they create what's called the studio system that dominates film production for the next 30 years. Some of these maybe you've heard of: Paramount, 20th Century Fox, MGM. They're going to own their own production facilities, and they will distribute worldwide through their networks, and they will control this industry. They'll keep their own kind of grouping of actors, directors, screenwriters under contract, so that they are cornering that market. Movies are going to be incredibly popular. They're going to be glamorous, sophisticated. They'll have a sex appeal. We're going to see stars that it kind of project the look of the 20s. We have Greta Garbo, who became kind of this mysterious goddess on the film in the film industry. She gives off that bob hairstyle, skimpy skirts. She creates the look of the flapper, and people are going and watching these films. They're taking it in. Americans flocked to see the Hollywood spectacle, such as the Ten Commandments, with its cast of thousands and dazzling special effects. There will be slapstick comedies that star Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton. Those will be incredibly popular as well. Like the radio, movies are going to create this new pop culture with common speech, dress, behavior, heroes, and they're going to reinforce racial stereotypes, degrading minority groups, where we'll see those stereotypes kind of carried through. Now, this all comes with technology is changing. In the home, and we'll talk about this more with women, but in the home, we see more technology that gives people more time. Instead of having to do those menial household tasks, they get more time to have leisure time. Instead of having to dedicate so much of their time outside of work to keeping a home, they now have time to relax, which is when they take in these movies and listening to the radio. The 1920s, we're also going to see the age of heroes. Sports is what we're looking at here. Spectator sports are going to attract vast audiences during this decade. The country needed heroes. We are coming off of World War One. We are depressed. We need to have faith back into human life again, instead of seeing this negative side of death and war and destruction. We needed to be pulled out of what we had been living in for so long, for years, and kind of find hope in something, and that hope was sports. And we'll see that in prize fighters like Jack Dempsey. He becomes a national idol. Team sports start to flourish. Americans are going to focus on those individual stars on those sports teams whose talents and personalities seem larger than life. And that's where we start to idolize these people. uh, we have professional football starting to take off in the college sphere, college football. We have Harold Red Granger, or Grange, in 1925, the galloping ghost halfback of the University of Illinois. He's going to attract 68,000 fans to a professional football game. That's crazy because people come to see him. They come to see how that game is going to play out because of this star. Baseball is going to draw even bigger crowds in than football. We'll have the scandal of the Chicago White Sox during this time, where three members tell a grand jury that they and five other players threw the 1919 World Series. We get the Black Sox scandal here, where we have the eight players that admitted to throwing the World Series being banished from the sport. Baseball will regain its popularities with Babe Ruth, Yogi Berra, and the sport is going to give people this idea that they have something to believe in. They tune in. They want to hear how the game goes. They want to hear their team do well. And it gives us something to believe in a time where we needed someone, something to believe in. We'll also have people like Charles Lindbergh, an aviator who was known for crossing the Atlantic on the first solo and nonstop trip around the world. He becomes a figure that people want to hear how he's doing. Did he make it? Did the plane crash? And this gives the nation something to unite on. The changing culture continues. You're going to read this week in your documents, the Unit 9 document set 1, about the this changing culture's effect on women. But we need to talk about it just a little bit here so that we can lay the groundwork for your documents. And as you guys kind of showed, the most familiar symbol of the 1920s is the flapper. This was a young woman with bobbed hair and a short skirt who drank, smoked, and maybe said some things that were unladylike, in addition to being considered more sexually free than previous generations. But in reality, a lot of young women in the 1920s did none of those things, except many did adopt that fashionable flapper wardrobe. But they get this negative connotation because they had freedoms. They could vote. The 19th Amendment is going to be passed in 1920. Millions of women are going to start working in white collar jobs as stenographers and other industries where they're not, being raised to become a wife and have a family. There are going to be more women. I'm not saying all women, because that tradition of women getting married and building a home is still very ingrained in the United States and will be for decades to come. But this is a time where you see a significant number of women shifting and kind of making a stand for themselves in society outside of the role of motherhood and wife. We have the increased availability of birth control devices. This is going to allow women to have fewer children. So instead of their only job being to have children, they can be a mom, take care of the home, and kind of have their own personality as well. New machines and technologies like the washing machine and the vacuum cleaner eliminate some of the drudgery of household work. So instead of that monotonous activity every day that would take hours upon hours to accomplish, you have women being able to get that household work done quicker and can, like I said, have a personality and a life. Um, The changing culture of the 20s is also going to have an effect on American youth. We still had child labor practices, okay? Child labor in the 1920s is not going to be illegal. Remember, they tried to pass the Keating-Owens Act in the Progressive era, but it doesn't work. So child labor is still very much in play. But we have more and more states passing restrictions against the exploitation of children in the workplace. We are also going to see the average number of years spent in school for young Americans rise during this time. Parents are also going to start waiting longer to kind of marry their children off. And what this leads to is a new stage of life, the teenage phase. American adolescents are going to start displaying traits that are kind of unknown among the young children and kind of unknown among the adults. The name teenager isn't going to come into play until a few decades later, but the mindset of teenagers comes from the 1920s. The single greatest factor that gives way to this teenage phase of life is the automobile. Teenagers are going to have the freedom from parental supervision that had not been known to previous generations. This leads to dating instead of arranged marriages. The automobile is also going to direct us to another huge factor that gives the teenage culture, which is the consolidated high school. Because we have this easier form of transportation, no longer do we have to have many different schools in rural areas. We now can consolidate these schools and have less of them and have buses go pick up kids and bring them there. You guys are no stranger to this idea. So, because we can do that, we can transport students farther from their homes. This declines the need for one room schoolhouses. We now can kind of delineate from that one room schoolhouse and have different grade levels. And that puts a little bit more emphasis on the need for education and the idea that we can have a more individualized education experience, and we start to see a little bit more potential for a longer education. And states are going to start to have schooling laws where you have to go to school for a number of years. And this helps. So we're going to see this changing culture of the American teenager based on the car, based on education. And this gives us a whole new subset of people in the United States. All right, you read a little bit of poetry from the Harlem Renaissance last week, but what we're going to see is, so we talked about the Great Migration a little bit in the last unit. The Great Migration is that massive movement from the south to the north in search of those industrial jobs and in the hope that we would kind of escape the intense racism of the south. But in the north, there is still racism. There is still segregation. There is still discrimination in the workplace and in society. But the Great Migration is what leads us to the Harlem Renaissance, because we have a large number of African Americans migrating from the South to the northern cities, into cities like Chicago and New York, which leads us to the Jazz Age. We have this formation of a unique culture because we have people coming from different backgrounds moving into one space, and this mixing of the cultures, which is just absolutely monumental. We are going to see jazz rise in popularity and kind of help to generate this cultural shift that we see in the 1920s. It's going to be very popular in speakeasies, which were those illegal nightclubs where you have alcohol being sold during Prohibition times. We see jazz become very popular with stars like Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Chick Webb, other famous entertainers play in venues like the Apollo Theater and the Cotton Club. African American jazz was played more frequently on those urban radio stations than on those suburban counterparts. So while we do have the radio connecting us across the nation, we start to see that split between cities and suburbs of the culture that's being cultivated. Young people in the 1920s are going to be influenced by jazz to rebel against the traditional culture of previous generations, a rebellion that went hand in hand with the fads in the bold fashion, with the flappers and new radio concerts. We have dances such as the Charleston, developed by African Americans, instantly becoming popular with different demographics, including young white people. Um, we are going to see jazz be introduced to large scale radio in 1922, where Americans are going to be able to experience different styles of music without physically having to go to a jazz club. And this is huge. This changes and gives us uh, a different perspective on music. When jazz hits the stage, it is a combination of many different forms of music that comes together. Um, but hand in hand with this, we are going to see racial prejudice be prevalent at most radio stations. White jazz artists are going to receive more airtime than black jazz artists, such as Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, and Joe King Oliver. Uh, Big jazz bands are going to be popular on the radio and bring in African American style and influence a predominantly white cultural scene. And this is big. When you read the poetry, when you listen to the music of this time period, it really illustrates a lot of the racial strife that was being experienced. Um, the Great Migration is going to bring southern countryside to northern cities and increase the visibility of black culture. And it's going to make white Americans a little uncomfortable. Millions of people in places like Indiana and Illinois are going to flock to the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. The Klan is going to represent that return to the values of America instead of that fast paced, city slicker 1920s that they believed was trampling the tradition of the United States. Um, Cars are going to give people the freedom to go where they want to go. And this is important because many young people are going to want to dance. Those crazy dances like the Charleston, the cakewalk, the black bottom, the flea hop, and jazz bands are going to be what's playing the music that goes with those. So you will see dance halls in New York City and Chicago, the major cities, where people go to dance, to listen to the music. Older people are going to object to jazz music and say that it's vulgar, that it's a moral disaster. But the younger generations love the freedom that they felt on the dance floor. Novels from famous writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald are going to document the chronicles of the jazz age. And this shift in music represents exactly the shift that was happening in other facets of the 1920s. We are moving away from culture, the traditional culture that had been in the United States, and we are modernizing in every aspect that we can possibly imagine. And the music is just one of them. All right, we've got to look at the changing attitudes of the 1920s, because not only do we have a changing culture, but we have a changing attitudes of the people within the United States as well. The Red Scare. You have heard of the Red Scare before, okay? The Red Scare, the first wave of the Red Scare is going to take place between 1918 and 1920. The Red Scare is a wave of fear of suspected communists and radicals that are plotting to take down the democracy of the United States. And this originates from the communist revolts that were taking place in Central and Eastern Europe at the time. So we have the anti-communist Red Scare taking place in the United States, where we are going to see widespread nativist or anti-immigrant hysteria. This is going to lead to the extremely aggressively restrictive immigration laws that we have talked about already. Remember the National Origins Act of 1924, setting that quota that's going to exclude people from Eastern Europe and Asia in favor of other immigrants that we deemed more fit for our society from Northern Europe and people from Great Britain, for example. These conflicts are what we see historians call a cultural civil war between city dwellers and small town residents, the Protestants and the Catholics, the blacks and the whites, the new women and advocates of the old family style. And this cultural civil war of the 1920s brings us to this extreme point of the Red Scare. The first Red Scare is going to take place in the wake of World War I. You guys probably talked about the Russian Revolution last year, where we saw the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, kind of topple over the Romanov dynasty and kick off the Communist Party. And this inspires a fear of Bolsheviks and anarchists around the world. In the United States, at that same time, labor strikes are on the rise. And this is where we start to see the public going against laborers when they strike. The press is going to lead to these attitudes. The press is going to sensationalize labor strikes being caused by immigrants that are setting out to bring down the American way of life. And that kind of panic spreads throughout the United States and really affects people. The Sedition Act of 1918, that we also talked about in the last unit, is going to target people who criticize the government. It's going to start to monitor radicals and labor unions with the threat of deportation. So we're going to tell people that if you can't fall in line, then you won't be here. This fear, as it always does, is going to turn to violence in 1919 when we see a set of anarchist bombings in the United States that target law enforcement and government officials in cities such as Boston, Cleveland, Philadelphia, D.C., New York City. And this only grows the Red Scare even further during this time. It pushes us towards the Palmer raids. The Palmer raids are going to be started by the Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, A. Mitchell Palmer. And what these Palmer raids do is push for law enforcement at the time to go into people's homes and search for immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe that we can label as communists, as a threat to America, and we can deport them, we can torture them, all under the guise of, well, they're a threat to the American democracy. And the Red Scare really pushes forward this fear in Americans, and fear is an extreme driving force. And we're going to talk more about the Red Scare, which kind of pushes us into a period of unrest that becomes known as the Red Summer in class this week. To continue on with the effects of the Red Scare, one of the biggest effects that we see it can be noted through the story of the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, which took place during this time period. There was a belief that that we have talked about before, this belief that native-born citizens are to be favored over immigrants, and that exact idea of nativism can be seen through this case. Now, there's a few players in this case that we need to be made aware of. The first is going to be the American Civil Liberties Union, and they are going to come in on the side of Nicholas Sacco and Bartholomew Vanzetti. This is going to be one of the most controversial cases of the time. So let's just jump right in. A paymaster and a security guard are going to be killed during an armed robbery of a shoe company in Massachusetts. This crime is going to lead us to this case. Okay, so the murder is what starts here. The people that were murdered were Fred Parmenter and Alessandro Berardelli. I always say his name wrong. Berardelli. They're both going to be shot several times as they attempted to move the payroll boxes out of the shoe company in Massachusetts. The two armed thieves are going to be identified by witnesses as Italian-looking who fled in a Buick. The car is going to be later found abandoned in the woods several days later, and through evidence that's found in the car, police are going to suspect a man named Mike Boda is involved. However, this Mike Boda is one step ahead of the authorities, and he had already fled to Italy. The police are going to say, well, if we can't get Boda, then let's get his colleagues. And the colleagues that they find are Sacco and Vanzetti, who were each carrying loaded weapons at the time of their arrest. And this does not bode well for them. Vanzetti was also identified as a participant in previous robberies of a different shoe company. They're both labeled as anarchists during this time of the Red Scare. That's absolutely terrifying. And because of this label of anarchist, this fear of communism, this fear that the United States is going to be torn down by immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti are going to be put on public trial as a message to send to all immigrants in the United States. There's going to be millions of dollars that are raised for their defense by radical lefts around the world. The American Embassy in Paris is going to be bombed during this time as a response to the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Another bomb is going to be intended for the American Embassy in Lisbon, but that was intercepted. So this case becomes not only national but globally recognized as a fight between tradition and change, as a fight between natives and immigrants. The well-funded defense is going to put up a good fight. They're going to bring in nearly 100 witnesses to testify in the defendant's behalf, but ultimately the eyewitness identification was crucial. We have another crucial piece being the ballistics that were tested of the murder weapon, and this ballistic evidence with the experts are going to testify that Sacco's gun was the murder weapon. And even knowing the defense experts are going to claim the opposite, Sacco and Vanzetti are going to be found guilty on very circumstantial evidence and nothing that was enough, but they're both going to be sentenced to death to be made an example of. Uh, this is a very controversial case, not only because of the factor of the Red Scare and nativism in here, but we also are going to see that the ballistics issued refused to go away as Sacco and Vanzetti waited on death row, even knowing there was disputes against that ballistic evidence. While they're in jail, they're going to have a jailhouse snitch that says that there was a confession that fuels this case. And what we're ultimately going to see is that Sacco and Vanzetti are going to be executed in 1927, even knowing new evidence did not settle down the controversy. So they tried to submit new ballistic evidence to prove that Sacco's gun wasn't the murder weapon, to bring about question that they were truly innocent in this case, but none of the new evidence sways the opinion, and both men are going to be executed, making an example out of this case. Later on, in many decades later, we are going to find out that Sacco's revolver was indeed the one that fired the bullet and killed the 2 security guards. But in 1977, the Massachusetts governor at the time is going to issue a proclamation that Sacco and Vanzetti had not received a fair trial. So while the evidence may have proven that they did commit the crime, they did not get a fair trial on the way to that. Nativism is going to be illustrated in a couple of different ways in the United States at the time. We'll see it come out. And like I mentioned in previous slides, we have the Emergency Quota Act, the National Origins Act, setting that limit on immigrants that were deemed as that new wave of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe to the United States. And like we'll talk about more in class, the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan during this time, or re-emergence, we should really say. Another big piece that we have talked about at some length is prohibition. Prohibition is the 18th Amendment that is passed after a big push from the temperance movement. The temperance movement it was pushing to get rid of alcohol in the United States, which gives us the ineffective Great American Experiment of outlawing the manufacturing and distribution of alcohol. Its ineffective enforcement throughout the United States leads us into organized crime. We have bootleggers who are making their own alcohol that can be incredibly dangerous because it's unregulated, as was much other products during this time. But we also have speakeasies who are selling the alcohol, and we have the mob who is working on that distribution from the bootleggers to the speakeasies. So Americans never really stopped drinking. They just start doing it more illegally, and that's when we see the 21st Amendment. The 21st Amendment reverses the 18th Amendment. So we see about 14 years in between these where we realize that it's just not going to work. We cannot outlaw alcohol in the United States, and the 21st Amendment pretty much takes back prohibition. Now we have one more big case to cover, and we are going to briefly cover it here, and we'll dive deeper into it in class because I know this lecture is getting a little bit long for you. But the Scopes monkey trial is going to involve quite a few key players, but the basic plot line here, and like I said, we'll delve a little bit more deeply into it in class this week, is we have Charles Darwin who comes up with the theory of evolution, where people evolved over time from monkeys into people, and that theory is one that you have heard. Well, because of a law that was passed, the Butler Act that was passed, you could not teach evolution in schools. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, is going to want to test out this law and see how constitutional it really is. So, what they do is they get a man who is named John James Scope, a Tennessee high school science teacher, to break the law, to teach evolution in Tennessee where it had been made illegal. The American Civil Liberties Union says in order to get this law into the court of public opinion and into the courts, we have to break it, and we need to find somebody who will do that. So the ACLU, with the lawyer of Clarence Darrow, is going to get John James Scopes to purposefully break the law, teach evolution in his classroom, and when he does so, he gets arrested. Now, you are going to have the Christian fundamentalists on the other side who argue that this law is moral, it is okay because evolution is not real. Evolution should not be taught in schools because it goes against religion. In this case is the ultimate display of the cultural clash between tradition and new age beliefs, between culture and religion. On the side of the Christian fundamentalists, we will see a character that we have seen a couple of times now come back up. William Jennings Bryan from the Populist Party, the People's Party, is going to make an appearance and argue against Clarence Darrow on this case. And this case has some pretty big fireworks that, like I said, we will talk more about in class. But know that this is the case that we turn to when we look at the 1920s to note the clash between culture changes and religion. All right, to keep this lecture short, we are going to see that the 1920s was a pivotal time for the United States because of the contradictions that we see of culture and tradition. We are going to see the change in technology, the change in society, and the change of politics during this decade that are going to really speed us into the 1930s, which we will look at all next week. But let's enjoy the little bit of time that we have focusing on the advancements, the cultural changes, while not always positive, of the 1920s. Do not forget about your 2 assignments for this week. You have Journal 22 that is due, do your 4 readings, and you have the Unit 9 document set 1 that is due, and make sure that you start working on paper 8 for this week as well, your Unit 9 paper. Any questions? Let me know.